Right, hi, I'm Michael. Thanks, Living Content, for doing this. Um, I'm just going to talk about a couple of series. One that I started like 8 years ago, and then I'm going to kind of tie that to a series of works that I have up right now. But first, I'm just going to give like a really quick background to kind of some of the thinking around my practice. And it kind of is a continuation of a systems aesthetics, which is was a term coined by the critic Jack Burnham in 1968, basically to describe what he saw as these emerging kinds of artistic practices that weren't really about objects, but they were about kind of the reorganization of kind of existing systems that could be social systems or ecological systems, often kind of using or in dialogue with kind of new technologies. There's like a lot of different kinds of art practices that kind of fell under that umbrella for him, and I'm kind of particularly interested in like legacies of institutional critique. So Hantaka's condensation cube, I think, was interesting in that it was sort of kind of it kind of have a kind of feedback loop between an object and the kind of institutional context of the gallery. So the kind of humidity controls of the gallery have this kind of feedback to the way condensation formed within this discrete object. But that kind of barrier between the object and the space is kind of broken down. And kind of roughly at the same time, there was all these artists kind of taking a different kind of critical take to gallery spaces by kind of trying to leave them behind and saying, okay, let's go out into the open West, this kind of tabula rasa, and make works that kind of exist completely outside of that institutional context. And I think both these kind of approaches are really interesting, but they don't really hold up, especially now. For example, you can't really think of a space like where double negative is as completely a blank slate. We kind of, I think especially given a kind of systems take on that space, it's probably organized by things like real estate land values, or things like climate change that are kind of these kind of human, somewhat kind of cultural effects that have an impact across the entire planet. And then I think on the other hand, thinking about institutional critique, it's sort of really difficult to think about where the boundaries of like an art space, a gallery, or museum end. Like they're kind of implicated with all kinds of systems of like global capital, or in many ways they're also implicated with systems like the use of energy that have these kind of environmental implications, et cetera. So somehow these two things kind of start to merge for me. And so in like 2012, I started this project that's kind of ongoing. A lot of my works kind of start with I kind of set up a structure for creating works. It kind of then is a kind of infinite series, where I started this series called Carbon Copies. And in this series of works, basically what I did is I wanted to kind of find a way to directly tie together kind of artistic production in kind of a somewhat more traditional sense with these kind of larger kind of global environmental impacts. And there were a bunch of reasons why I started this, but maybe kind of the easiest way to start is just to kind of explain in a really dumb way kind of what the works were and how they functioned. And so for the series, what I did is I found a way to calculate the carbon emissions from the production of an artwork. And I kind of limited it to artworks made in the last 10 years so I could kind of ensure that the sort of metrics I was using were more or less accurate. But for each work, I found some way to kind of figure out, in the end, it was really a kind of a partial calculation of the energy expenditure for that work. So for example, this is a kind of a carbon copy of a Jan Vo's We the People. And to make that calculation for the energy expenditure in the work, I determined how much copper was used in that piece, and it's 31 tons. And then through that, I was able to determine what the kind of energy expenditure was to kind of create the copper for that piece. And so the energy expenditure for that was around 84 tons of CO2. And so once I knew that, I had a system where I was making these kind of very small like models of the works that were all sized to be like the kind of a volume that was 1/500th of the volume of CO2 released. So there were kind of these scale models representing that carbon footprint. And they were all these models were always produced with that same scale, so you could kind of read them against each other to see the difference in those carbon footprints. And they were all kind of reimagined as these cubes to kind of make that volume more visible. And then once I had done that, I think I started out making about 20 different copies for 20 different recent artworks. I had a show where they were for sale, but they were for sale in exchange for the purchase of carbon offsets, so that when the works were sold, that the carbon emissions from that original work were kind of erased. And I did this, everyone had a different kind of story and calculation. I'm just showing a couple. This was for Vanessa Beecroft's performance, VB64, where for that performance, Kanye West flew in from Paris Fashion Week to like produce the film, and then flew back. And so I used that kind of, he hired a private jet. I used the calculation for the energy expenditure of that private jet to determine the calculation for the carbon emissions for that work. And so everyone kind of has a different way that I measured it, just as kind of partly to kind of show the various kinds of energy expenditures that are a part of these works. It can be, literal kind of fabrication. It could be exhibition. It could be documentation. For some, it was like having a private event where 50 people fly in from somewhere to see the work, if it's site specific. So all these different ways that these recent artworks kind of consume energy. This kind of like base measurement for understanding the works. But for me, it was like this invisible kind of shadow version of these works, that they're not just the object, they're not just the performance, they're not just these sort of visible sides, but there's this invisible kind of negative version of the work that was sort of being enacted in the atmosphere. And I wanted to first of all make that kind of invisible footprint visible, which was sort of the reason for making these models, but then also to act directly within that as a kind of in itself a kind of medium for art making. So in a way, all of these kind of series of transactions and making the models, all those things, was kind of leading up to this gesture of erasure. And I think for me, it was kind of, I was also thinking about like, this is a certificate, by the way. I worked with a carbon offset company to certify then the purchase of these verified offsets. And so this kind of accompanies each of those copies when one is purchased. But what was I saying? I think one of the things I was thinking about when working on this piece was like, kind of like, how do you make a kind of like, a left turn from a certain kind of like way of making work or kind of art historical tradition? And I was thinking about Rauschenberg's erased de Kooning and that kind of gesture erasure and that kind of having this like kind of like Oedipal relationship, but also being a way of saying, I'm going to start a kind of a new kind of artistic practice on kind of new terms. And so for me, the sort of erasure of these footprints was both kind of had that sense of being like, okay, this isn't, this whole kind of mostly kind of like art world boom work isn't really what I'm interested in, but I want to use that to kind of point towards a new way of working. And for me, it was saying, how can I work directly with these kind of like larger structures? In this case, the kind of atmosphere itself and its sort of the human effects within that atmosphere. How can I work with that as a kind of new medium for art making? So it was just kind of like, how do I kind of clear the air and open up this new field by kind of drawing this connection between a whole set of kind of existing practices and trying to kind of open up this new space that I want to work within in a more direct way. These are just a bunch of them, sort of many different recent artworks, and you can kind of see how you can read this kind of scale of those footprints against, by looking at the different scale of the different models. Anyway, so that's something, I started a while ago. I kind of keep producing them, for various reasons. It's open that they can continue. As more works are produced, there's always a possibility of figuring out what those invisible emissions are, and then kind of going through that practice of erasing them by using that kind of existing kind of structure of like, what does a commercial gallery do? It sells these objects, kind of repurposing that to have this environmental effect. So anyways, this last summer, I worked on a series of pieces that also deal with carbon emissions, but in a very different way. And I think in a little bit more of this kind of, in this space that I kind of hope to open up through that earlier work, almost 8 or so years ago. And this is a series of works called The Drowned World. The title comes from a Ballard short novel from I think '62 or so, where he imagines it's a sort of a science fiction novel, and it's basically about global warming, but not understood in the way we understand it today. It's, in his science fiction world, it's like the sun is expanding, and this is causing the polar ice caps to melt and to flood most of the globe. So the cause it's not human caused warming, but it's sort of prescient in imagining those effects of kind of rising sea levels and that sort of thing. But I think what was really interesting to me about that story is that he imagines that as the world warms and as these sort of seas take over the planet, it actually restores this kind of ancient environment when the Earth was warmer, when these sort of shallow seas covered most of the planet, and it's really the era of the Carboniferous. And he describes a lot of the plants and things kind of re-emerging, alligators and crocodiles and things like that, but also like giant horsetails and these things that were started to be recognized mostly in the Victorian period when, first of all, coal became an important resource, but it also opened up then this kind of window into this past time. And so Victorian scientists would collect these samples from coal and begin to identify all of these mostly extinct ancient plant and animal species. And that period was about 300 million years ago, but it was a period that produced basically all of the world's coal reserves. So I kind of wanted to take this premise of kind of climate change restoring kind of an ancient atmosphere more kind of literally and seriously. And I first started by just kind of trying to kind of visualize, what were the kinds of like living organisms that actually are responsible for creating coal. And part of this was also trying to visualize a sort of biological version of modernity. Because I think for me, when I think about the kind of like material imaginary of modernity, of industrialization, it's like very inorganic materials like steel and glass, concrete. But it seemed so important to me to kind of recognize this kind of biological inheritance in the form of fossil fuels that is kind of undergirds industrialization and modernity. And to me, it was sort of an overlooked visual dimension on one hand. So I started looking for ways to kind of see that kind of lost world, that lost kind of living vegetative world of the Carboniferous. And I started doing that by collecting mostly very small fragments of plant fossils from the Carboniferous, and kind of photographing the way to kind of draw out the kind of details of those lost organisms. So it's a little hard. All these images are very dark, actually, so they might be hard to see. But this was a series of works kind of imaging, like this is a Myriopterous fern. What's interesting is that these fossils are mostly actually recorded in coal itself. So kind of, these fossil fuels actually in some cases retain traces of the organisms that form them. This is a Lepidodendron impression. Some of them have these really interesting geometries too, because these are the kind of, where these leaves would pull away if a Lepidodendron would leave these imprints. Another kind of Myriopterous fern. So there's a series of these things just trying to say, okay, what is this unseen kind of organic origin of modernity, and how can we kind of see this? And I was kind of producing them also in this sort of like modernist idiom, which seemed appropriate. And then I had the chance this summer to install a couple kind of more site-specific iterations of this work in a botanical garden as part of Manifesta 12 in Palermo. One of the sites for that show is this old botanical garden in Palermo. And so I was looking for ways to kind of bring back or kind of use these very ancient kinds of organisms that to me are at the root of fossil fuels and kind of what I consider almost like fossil fuel modernity. This piece uses cyanobacteria to kind of colonize its existing decorative pool in the space. And so cyanobacteria is very interesting because it was the very first organism to use chlorophyll to photosynthesize. And it created this kind of this huge change in the atmosphere of the planet. So before cyanobacteria evolved, there was virtually no oxygen in the atmosphere, only in like very trace amounts. But because photosynthesis would then produce oxygen, as these organisms kind of spread throughout the oceans, the atmosphere like completely changed. So it went from having no oxygen to ultimately having huge quantities of oxygen. And I think what's interesting is that for most of the kinds of life that had evolved up to this point, oxygen was very toxic. And so this event, some people call it the Great Oxygenation Event, kind of killed off like almost all life on Earth except for these new kinds of organisms. So some scientists call it the Great Oxygenation Event, but other scientists call it the Oxygen Holocaust because it was probably the greatest extinction event in kind of the history of the Earth. So this strange paradox between this kind of, the kind of production of the conditions that allow most of the kinds of life that we know today also kind of initiated this mass extinction. And it's sort of almost a metaphor for the conditions that we're under today where, human-caused, modification to the atmosphere are also initiating this mass extinction. Also, just in terms of the kind of more artistic side, I thought it was interesting that in a way this was the first green. The Earth was maybe a kind of a rust or purple up until that point, and with the kind of advent of these chlorophyll photosynthesizers, the Earth became green very quickly. The other work was more directly engaged with that relationship between kind of the Earth, living organisms, and the atmosphere that I kind of placed in the Carboniferous period. And so this next work is sort of a living counterpart to that more kind of purely imagistic series of photographs of those Carboniferous plants. So what was very interesting about this site of the Botanical Garden is there's a high wall on the back side of the Botanical Garden, and across from that, there's a kind of now defunct coal gas plant. And so this was a place where coal was heated and the gas captured and put into these big tanks that were used mostly to light all the street lights in the city up until the 70s, which is really late for coal gas. But it was just they continued using this kind of like 19th century technology for a long time. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to find a way to, within this site of kind of coal production and kind of fossil fuel extraction, to actually use that as a site where a carboniferous type forest could re-emerge. And kind of imagining the circular logic, which is what goes back to sort of my kind of more like science-y reading of the drowned world, where as we burn fossil fuels, the kind of human-induced global warming event, we are actually restoring, by burning these ancient plants, we're restoring the atmosphere in which these plants first emerged. And so this site was sort of the perfect place to say, this is the place where a carboniferous forest should start to reemerge, the very site that kind of produced these conditions. So imagining that kind of circle. Because the site was very, very toxic, it hasn't really been cleaned up, and access was really restricted. It ended up not being possible to allow people to come into the forest, and so we built this stair that allowed you to kind of peek over this high wall into the forest below. So this is the view then into this carboniferous forest planted between these two big gas tanks. So the two tanks would hold the coal gas after it had been produced. And it's really interesting because even though it's defunct, it still smells of coal gas in the air, like that kind of, it feels like almost like it was shut down yesterday, even though it's been 40 years or so. And so the species that I brought in are all the kinds of plants that would have existed in the Carboniferous period. So even though those, it's 300 million years ago, those exact species don't exist, but their kind of descendants do. And this was before the evolution of flowering plants. So it's things like ferns, araucarias, cycads, echinidums. So basically I found all these kind of living equivalents of these plants really from around the world, because at that time, in the Carboniferous, almost all the continents were nearly connected, and there was sort of this one continuous, almost like swampland in that time, and so the descendants of those species basically exist all around the world at this point. And this is a short film just showing the relationship between the forest and the site. All right, thanks.
Okay, again, we have time for 2 or 3 questions, so.
I have an almost mundane, materialistic question. From the start, what does it mean to, like, in terms of physical process to offset carbon and create this kind of contemporary fossil? What were those sculptural pieces? What constitutes that?
Okay, so there's 2 sides actually. So maybe I didn't. No, I think I didn't describe it very well. So the first step was I just created these maquettes, mostly just out of paper. I made them like on a desk, so they're in themselves, they're kind of quite low energy. They're like paper glued together with pencil on them. Those are really just meant to kind of visualize that existing footprint of those works. To offset them, I worked with this a French company called Vector Carbone that sells verified carbon offsets. And what those are is it's similar to the kind of like legal system under the Kyoto Protocol, but it's a more voluntary system. But they're vetted in similar ways, where basically they invest in carbon offsetting projects that can be things like planting a forest or building hydroelectric power or carbon sequestration, where they draw carbon out of the air. And there's a kind of these different kind of regulatory bodies that come in and kind of verify those projects and determine, okay, this project is, removes X tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And once that's verified, then you can purchase, usually at something would be like $10 a ton. Basically, you fund those projects. But there's sort of like this offset system so that for every like $10 offset you buy, it is equivalent to the removal of 1 ton of CO2 from the atmosphere by funding those projects. So it's sort of like this widespread system that kind of, it was meant to kind of like be used in conjunction with like a carbon tax. So you basically, by buying these offsets, it's a way of sort of, you're buying the negative tonnage of CO2 in the atmosphere. So I kind of use that sort of, the kind of way that you would, a collector would buy a work, that instead of buying the work is sold in this negative tonnage. So it was only once they were sold, and those were then used to purchase these carbon offsets that erasure took place. So the objects are really there to facilitate that transaction. It's sort of acknowledging that, a collector they want something. Like, they're not just going to buy a negative carbon offset, so they kind of facilitated that exchange.
What was this last piece? It was
It's in Palermo, in Sicily.
okay.
Yeah.
How did you determine which pieces to offset in your carbon copy project, and also were you in conversations with the artists who made the original pieces?
Yeah.
Did you realize that you were doing this project based on your work?
Yeah, I generally wasn't. When I started, I think it's gotten a little easier to get information around works just because there's more stuff just like posted online or whatever. When I first started, there was like not as much as that. So I was doing things like reading like New Yorker, Calvin Tompkins profiles of artists and just kind of like reading them until I saw some figure or something. And sometimes they were like, you would find figures associated with artworks that are supposed to be kind of impressive, like, oh, like this Sarah is like this many tons of steel or something like that. So I kind of just had to be kind of open to finding information I knew could sort of be translated into some kind of calculation. So that partly determined it, just sort of the chance of finding the right information. But when I first did it, I also just wanted to find a range of different kinds of artworks, different kinds of ways of calculating that. But it was also kind of like, because on some level, it was a response to this sort of, inflated kind of art production. A lot of them were kind of more this kind of like blue chip contemporary kind of work, because in a way that was sort of felt very dominant, especially at that time when I started, and I was sort of a way of sort of like using that as a sort of springboard to something else, and kind of like using that scale almost as a springboard to something else. But right now it's sort of, it's been a year and a half or so since I was kind of actively producing those. But I'm kind of always just kind of like, I don't know, just kind of like aware of, certain works that become more visible, kind of in a, I think, and kind of thinking about whether I can translate them into this project. But I think it was also about choosing works that were in themselves highly visible, like kind of like iconic in some way, because I kind of wanted, first of all, the viewer to kind of know what they were looking at and kind of be able to make that translation. So something you're already familiar with, but kind of like defamiliarizing it.